Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Daryl Kimball. I'm Executive Director of the Arms Control Association. We're an independent, non-governmental, nonpartisan organization. I'm speaking to you from Washington, D.C. Thanks for joining us for our briefing today on smarter options for U.S. nuclear weapons modernization. For well over a decade, the Arms Control Association has advocated for a more cost-effective approach to U.S. nuclear weapons spending that takes into account the goal of phasing out the most destabilizing and dangerous types of nuclear capabilities, also taking into account the United States' responsibilities and obligations to achieve further reductions in the bloated global nuclear arsenals. More recently, we've published a comprehensive analysis of the cost of the current program of record by our Director for Disarmament and Threat Reduction Policy, Kingston Reef, titled U.S. Nuclear Excess, and that is available online at www.nuclearexcess.org. In that report, we outline cost savings that would help save tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars, and still allow the United States to maintain a nuclear force and posture that meets or exceeds nuclear deterrence requirements. So in today's session, which comes just a week before the Biden administration submits its first annual spending request to Congress, we're going to dive into further details and outline why and how we think the United States can pursue common sense alternatives to the modernization program that the Biden administration has inherited from its predecessors. At the outset, I want to point out and underscore that the nuclear weapons lobby and some members of Congress who take contributions from the nuclear weapons lobby and those and many special interests are presenting a false choice about the U.S. nuclear weapons modernization program, that there is no alternative to the current $1.5 trillion modernization and sustainment plan, including the add-ons for new nuclear capabilities that were proposed by the Trump administration. In reality, there are serious, realistic alternatives to the current program of record, which is, in our view, excessive, costly, unsustainable, and in many ways, destabilizing and dangerous. Blindly following along the current path, we believe would run counter to the Biden administration's pledge that was expressed in its interim national security guidance document to, quote, take steps to reduce the role of nuclear weapons in our national security strategy, unquote. So our speakers today will address how the Biden administration can and should approach the nuclear modernization effort in the coming months and years. They're going to outline some alternatives to building a new fleet of intercontinental ballistic missiles, as well as some of the warheads that have been proposed for these new systems. They're going to address some of the challenges facing the National Nuclear Security Administration and its warhead infrastructure modernization plans. And we're going to take a look at the relationship between nuclear modernization and arms control diplomacy. Our first speaker today is Congressman John Garamendi of California, who's a member of the House Armed Services Committee and a key player in the debate about nuclear weapons policy and spending. Mr. Garamendi is also the co-chair of a new bicameral working group on nuclear weapons policy and arms control, which was established earlier this year. And after he speaks, and we'll be hearing from him in a video address that was recorded last Friday. We'll hear from a panel of 3 experts, and their discussion is going to be moderated by our in-house expert, Kingston Reef. And after that, we'll take your questions. So with that introduction, let me ask my team to queue up Congressman Garamendi's remarks, and I'll be back with you after he's finished.
Hello, I'm Congressman John Garamendi. I'd like to begin by thanking the Arms Control Association for hosting this important event. It comes at a critical juncture as the Biden administration begins to review its nuclear posture. Now, for 50 years, the Arms Control Association has been serving this nation by promoting public understanding of and support for effective arms control policies. They've been an invaluable resource to me and to my colleagues on Capitol Hill. Now, I just returned from a visit to Warren Air Force Base in Wyoming, where I was able to see our ICBM facilities and operations firsthand. Having seen the Minuteman III ICBMs up close and spoken with the Air Force personnel responsible for these missiles, I am more convinced than ever that we must have a serious and thoughtful discussion on our nuclear modernization plans. The world is witnessing a new nuclear arms race, and this one is extremely dangerous. Tensions rise between the great powers. As the United States and Russia and China rush to modernize their nuclear arsenals, the tripwire is growing much more tight. Observation and communication satellites and systems are increasingly vulnerable to attacks. All three countries are fielding stealth and hypersonic nuclear delivery systems. They're designed to evade detection. The risk of a false alarm or a political miscalculation has haunted the nuclear landscape forever, and they do even more today. The tripwire is indeed taut, and the risks are increasing. Without a doubt, there's a critical need to maintain a safe, secure, and effective nuclear deterrent. We understand that, as do our allies. But do we need to match and outdistance Russia? And does Russia need to match and outdistance the United States? And does China need to expand its nuclear forces to keep pace? Now, as of today, the answer in Washington, Moscow, and Beijing is, of course we must. And so the nuclear arms race continues, as does the ever-increasing risks and costs of building and maintaining our nuclear dominance strategy. Now, estimates by the Government Accountability Office state that the nuclear modernization program will cost at least $1 trillion over the next 30 years. Other vital military and domestic programs are already getting crowded out. Earlier this month, the Government Accountability Office noted that the current plan to modernize every part of the U.S. nuclear arsenal simultaneously is a recipe for schedule delays and cost overruns. Former Secretary of the Air Force, Heather Wilson, noted in December that fiscal year 2022 budget will see a steep increase in the cost of refurbishing the nuclear deterrents. With a flat budget, she said that the Air Force could not proceed with these plans without crushing its ability to handle all its other missions. Supporters of the current nuclear buildup tell us that the only choice is to proceed full steam ahead with the current plans or allow the arsenal to rust into obsolescence. This is a false choice. America is already fielding new submarines and stealth bombers and long-range cruise missiles and hypersonic missiles capable of delivering more than enough nuclear bombs anywhere in the world. Today, the real choice is to take a new path with two straightforward actions that we could take this year to address unnecessary and expensive programs. First, pause the development and deployment of the ground-based strategic deterrent, the GBSD, and stop the deployment of the submarine-launched cruise missile. And number two, aggressively pursue arms control negotiations with Russia and China. The Minuteman III intercontinental ballistic missile program could be life extended, and its planned replacement, the GBSD, could be paused. The Air Force leadership has confirmed that another retrofit and upgrade of the Minuteman III could extend its usefulness until late in the 2030s, when a new ICBM might be necessary to replace the Minuteman III. This single common sense step could save $37 billion. Now, of course, there's a very powerful argument that the silo-based ICBM Minuteman III system is unnecessary, as our bombers and submarines alone can provide adequate deterrence. Moreover, it's argued that these ICBMs are inherently dangerous because they must be launched within minutes of notification of a nuclear attack, or they would be lost in a missile attack. In every silo lies the big risk of a false alarm or a miscalculation. Now, bombers can be recalled, and subs cannot be found as they hide in the ocean. Arms control negotiations are an imperative, And the good news for America and the world is that President Biden wants to chart a new course. In March, the interim national security strategic guidance called for a reduction in the role of nuclear weapons in our national security strategy and to reestablish the U.S. as the leader in arms control negotiations. Within the first months of his presidency, Biden reversed the Trump policy and extended the New START treaty for 5 years. This treaty caps the number of nuclear deployed warheads and gives us the ability to conduct intrusive inspections of Russia's strategic nuclear forces. As a co-chair of the newly formed bicameral Nuclear Weapons and Arms Control Working Group, I, along with co-chairs Representative Beyer and Senators Merkley and Markey and 19 members of Congress, sent a letter to President Biden commending this action and encouraging more concrete steps to avoid a costly and dangerous arms race. The nuclear buildup by Russia, China, and the United States, it's not set in stone. We must encourage and support President Biden and his administration as they chart a new course in their nuclear posture review. This issue, it's far too important to get wrong. And all of us in elective office, we have a responsibility to understand and address this issue because the three great nuclear powers are rapidly building their nuclear arsenal, and the weapons that possess great risk, we have more than enough destructive power to obliterate life on Earth. Now, I want to end this with a personal memory of a visit to a United Kingdom submarine a couple of years ago. The submarine was about to deploy with 16 ICBMs and multiple nuclear bombs. The captain took great pride in his ship and its role of deterrence. As we were leaving the sub, I asked him, suppose you are ordered to launch your missiles and their nuclear bombs, and you follow the order. Then what do? Go home? To what? He didn't reply. He simply turned away.
Thank you, Congressman Garamendi, for those very thoughtful and detailed remarks about the issue before us, which provides a great lead-in to our expert panel that's just coming up right now, that our Director for Disarmament and Threat Reduction Policy, Kingston Reef, is going to moderate. So with that, let me turn things over to Kingston, and we will begin. Thank you, Kingston.
Thanks so much, Daryl. I think Daryl and Representative Garamendi have set the table very well. The animating question we are addressing this afternoon is how should the United States approach nuclear modernization? And in the Arms Control Association's view, current U.S. nuclear weapons policies exceed what is necessary for a credible nuclear deterrent, and their financial and opportunity costs are taking a growing toll. Yes, the U.S. nuclear arsenal is aging. If the United States is going to remain a nuclear armed state, significant modernization of the arsenal is going to be required. That would be the case even if the global security environment were more favorable, and the environment is not exactly a favorable one at the moment. So the question in our view is not whether to modernize, but how much, at what cost, and at what level of acceptable risk. The at what cost question is an important one. It's true that how we weigh the impact of the cost of nuclear weapons depends to a significant degree on the value we place on the weapons. And yet the reality is that as the cost of nuclear weapons continues to rise, and it is rising, the choices we make about what not to fund to pay for them are going to get increasingly difficult, especially amid a flat defense budget. And the longer we wait, the more suboptimal the choices are going to get. So for the remainder of the webinar this afternoon, we're going to drill down on some of the key debates and choices that are part of the larger modernization discussion. And we have three top-notch experts to do so. Our first speaker will be Steve Fetter. Steve is currently Associate Provost and Dean of the Graduate School at the University of Maryland and a former Assistant Director in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. Steve is going to address the hot-button issue of the future of the U.S. ICBM force, and whether, as the Pentagon argues, the current plan to build a new fleet of ICBMs via the Ground-Based Strategic Deterrent Program and a new warhead via the W-87-1 replacement program is the only option, or whether there are alternatives to maintaining a viable ICBM leg, namely by continuing to rely on the existing Minuteman III ICBM. Next, we will have Sharon Weiner. Sharon is currently Associate Professor at the School of International Service at American University and a former program examiner with the National Security Division of the White House Office of Management and Budget. Sharon is going to address the budget challenges facing the National Nuclear Security Administration, or NNSA, and the agency's ability to execute the ambitious modernization effort on its plate. The growth of the NNSA weapons activities budget over the past 4 years almost defies belief, but the enormous expansion of the scope and cost of the agency's mission has not received the attention it deserves. Sharon will also outline for us alternatives to the NNSA's current warhead life extension, plutonium pit production, and uranium enrichment approaches. And third, we will have Amy Wolf, a specialist in nuclear weapons policy at the Congressional Research Service. Amy is going to address an issue that has become a growing part of the modernization debate, and that is the argument that history demonstrates that the United States has the best chance of achieving its goals in arms control negotiations when our negotiating partners see a U.S. commitment to nuclear modernization in the budget. Amy is going to address the merits of this argument and assess what lessons history holds for the Biden administration as it considers its approach to both nuclear modernization and further arms control beyond New START. Each of our speakers will provide about 10 minutes of opening remarks, after which we'll turn to your questions. Many of you have already sent questions, and please be thinking of questions during speaker opening remarks and share them during the Zoom, using the Zoom Q&A function. And we'll aim to wrap up this session no later than 3:30. So with that, Steve, the virtual floor is yours.
Thanks, Kingston, and thanks to everyone who's joining the session. It's good to see so much interest in this topic. I begin by saying that I don't object to most of the strategic nuclear modernization programs that are underway. Submarines are the foundation of the nuclear deterrent, and bombers provide unique advantages over missiles for some missions. But we don't need to replace the Minuteman III ICBMs with a new missile, the Ground-Based Strategic Deterrent, or GBSD. My preference would be to allow Minuteman to age out and to rely entirely on submarines and bombers for deterrence. And that's because silo-based ICBMs are not survivable. And because they're not survivable, they demand quick decisions about their use. It's worth recalling that this was not always the case. When Minuteman was first deployed in hardened silos in the early 1960s, it was highly survivable because Soviet missiles were not very accurate. But by the end of the 1970s, missile accuracy had improved to the point where Minuteman was vulnerable to a disarming Soviet first strike. And a launch on warning or launch under attack option was created at that time to allow Minuteman to be launched in a few minutes before the missiles could be destroyed by incoming Soviet warheads. Many of the decision documents have been declassified. You can find them on the National Security Archive, and they describe this as a temporary solution and not as a satisfactory solution. You may recall a missile basing study being done on mobile options and a racetrack and deep underground basing to provide a survivable missile basing option. But none of those happened, and the temporary solution of a launch under attack option has endured now for 40 years, and the Department of Defense is proposing to extend it for another 50 years through GBSD. With a launch under attack option, silo-based ICBMs without a launch under attack option, silo-based ICBMs would have little value as a deterrent or as a retaliatory force. But launch under attack forces a president to make the most consequential decisions possible in just a few minutes. There have been false warnings in the past, although these were recognized as false before response decisions had to be made. We can't guarantee this will always be the case, particularly in the age of cyber attack. And even if the warning is accurate, the president should have more than a few minutes to decide on a response. And that just is not possible with silo-based ICBMs. If they're attacked, it forces an immediate choice between using them or losing them. If the 400 warheads that are now on ICBMs, on Minuteman, or on submarines at sea, there would be no need to make such a quick choice. And if we did not replace the ICBM, we wouldn't have to build a new warhead to replace the W-78 Minuteman warhead that is reaching the end of its service life. And this in turn would significantly relax requirements for new pit production. But I know that there are many policymakers who are not ready to move to a dyad and would like to retain ICBMs. And in that case, it would be much less expensive, particularly in the near term, to extend the life of Minuteman than to procure an entirely new missile system. Minuteman has undergone life extensions before, as recently as 20 years ago, and there is no technical reason it could not undergo a similar life extension. The solid rocket motors could be repoured, post-boost vehicles and guidance sets could be remanufactured, extending the life of the system beyond 2050. A RAND study concluded that Minuteman could be extended essentially indefinitely, and the Air Force examined this option in its analysis of alternatives, and it's my understanding that they concluded it could be done. And it would be cheaper. Well, the Air Force concluded it would be cheaper to build GBSD only because of the artificial time frame that they chose for the analysis to 2075, which would require a replacement missile be built for Minuteman before that point. But even if you would eventually have to produce a replacement to Minuteman in the distant future, there's still value to pushing those costs into the future. Because right now they add to the budget pressures associated with those other programs that I mentioned, like replacing the Ohio-class submarines. And by 2050 or 2055, we may then at that point be willing to give up silo-based ICBMs. Now, the Air Force does point out that testing will deplete the inventory of Minuteman missiles over time, and it would be unable to field a force of 400 deployed Minuteman missiles without making new missiles. That's true, but there's nothing special about the number 400. If we reduce the number of deployed missiles to 300, there would be plenty of Minutemen to sustain a force beyond 2050. And in addition to the traditional methods of life extension, which have been practiced in the past, which involve repouring motors and remanufacturing components, I believe there may be less expensive ways of extending the service life of Minuteman. So first, we could develop methods to assess the service life of each individual motor. The current method of determining the Minuteman service life is statistical, based on destructive testing of a small number of motors. These show that the propellant is hardening with age, raising the concern that at a certain age, some fraction of the motors might fail on ignition. But methods could be developed to non-destructively measure the property of the propellant in each motor, methods similar to those that in fact are used with the Trident missile, to see which motors are aging more gracefully and could be retained. This would be better than removing from deployment all missiles at the point when only a small fraction need to be retired. Second, we could develop improved methods to more accurately assess the service life of the Minuteman missile. I believe we know that the current methods are too conservative. That is, they underestimate service life. How do we know this? We know it because motors that were retired from service are used for missile defense tests and space launch. The Minuteman II first and second stages, which are essentially identical to the Minuteman III first and second stages, have demonstrated excellent reliability in launches 50 years of motors that are 50 years old, 2 to 3 times the original service life of the motors. If the models that were used to determine the original service life were accurate, these motors should have essentially a 0 probability of successful launch at an age of 50 years. But this isn't what has been observed in practice, so the models must be wrong, and advanced models, which rely more on first principle estimates of physical and chemical processes and aging, may be able to provide more accurate estimates. And then to conclude, I would say with regard to the Minuteman warhead, there is also a program as I mentioned earlier, to replace the W-78 warhead with a new warhead that would contain insensitive high explosive and other safety features. I also believe this is not necessary because there are enough W-87 warheads which contain insensitive high explosive and all modern safety features. There are enough of those warheads to equip the entire current Minuteman force. And so if the Air Force would like to improve the safety of the deployed force, it could do so immediately by equipping the entire force with the W-87, which is assessed to be a very safe and robust and reliable warhead. And with that, I will stop and turn it back over to Kingston.
Great, thanks so much, Steve. Sharon.
Thank you very much, Kingston. And thanks everyone else for joining in today. So my task is to talk about the warhead component of nuclear weapons. And so what I'd like to do is to briefly outline NNSA's schedule for the coming years. And the takeaway point from this is it's jam-packed with all sorts of different programs. And then I will talk about some of the persistent problems in NNSA's management of similar programs. And the takeaway from that is it is extraordinarily unlikely that these programs will be delivered on schedule and within cost. As a matter of fact, we should start assuming that excessive cost overruns are the norm for each of the programs that I'm going to mention. And then the third thing I'd like to do is to provide some alternatives to help mitigate some of these programs, to mitigate some of these problems, rather. So let me start off with NNSA's big jam-packed schedule. So for the next decade and longer, NNSA has a series of life extension programs for warheads that it's planning on undertaking. And life extension programs can be anything from replacement of some parts to close to the redesign of the entire warhead, including providing some new military capabilities. So NNSA is supposed to finish this year a life extension program for it's actually not quite a life extension program, it's called an ALT program for the W-88. It's also supposed to complete a life extension program for the B-61 delivered by aircraft, because that these projects are the ones that are closest to being finished, but both of them are behind their original schedules and both of them are also over budget. Next in line is the cruise missile, the W-80-4, which is currently in the studies and engineering phase. So what this should tell you is they're still trying to figure out the exact design characteristics and how they're going to go about producing it, which should be a clue for going up in price over the initial estimate. Next is the W-87-1, which Steve just mentioned, which is supposed to be the new ICBM warhead. It's also in the engineering and design phase. But if you look out into the future, there are a whole list of new activities that NNSA proposes to do. Everything from the W-93, which is supposed to be for submarines and is rumored to be a new warhead design, so something fundamentally different. And if you look into the future, you'll see things such as a notional future air-delivered warhead, future submarine replacement warhead. Basically, after a couple of decades, the plan is to have either refurbished or begin refurbishing literally every warhead in the arsenal, and then almost to start the cycle anew again. And so these life extension programs all have a couple of different things in common. Most specifically, that NNSA has shown that they have been unable to complete a LEP on schedule and on budget, and that the cost of these life extension programs has increased dramatically over time. And we can expect this to continue to be the case because the characteristics and the work that's being done in the life extension programs is becoming more and more ambitious over time. So for example, let's look at the B-61, which is about to be completed. They'll start to produce the first unit, hopefully here in another year or so. So this is a program that we should know the most about right now. So the B-61 experienced a 5-year delay over the original estimates and a cost increase of about $1 billion from a little over 7 to a little over 8 billion. Another LEP, which we are about, which is about to be finished, is the W80-4. Here, Nnsa adopted a delivery date for the first unit that was actually 1 year sooner than the program's own office thought they could actually deliver the life extension program. So Nnsa was more ambitious than its own program office. And when the US Government Accountability Office asked them to explain why, they said, well, that's because Congress gave us that date. Okay. So they were giving an estimate of a date which they knew they couldn't meet because Congress had picked that date as the estimate, as the day by which this warhead should be delivered. Similarly, they also estimated that the cost of the W80-4 LEP would be a little over $11 billion, even though NNSA's own independent cost estimate office put the cost at $14 billion. Right? And this is for a program that is significantly less ambitious than the ones that are scheduled in the future. So according to the US Government Accountability Office, there are about 100 different components that contain explosive materials and that are involved in a life extension program. And that these usually require coordination between a variety of different sites, subcontractors, manufacturers, et cetera. Right? So one of the reasons for this schedule overrun and cost overrun problem is that you would think over the course of about now 2 decades of planning life extension programs that NNSA would have in place a process to coordinate between the sites that produce these 100 or so different explosive components. And according to the US Government Accountability Office, they do, as of 2 years ago. There are a variety of other management problems, though, that persist. And I'll talk a little bit later about GAO's high risk list, the risk of programs for failure. And they identify a variety of problems which have persisted over the entire life of NNSA and which have yet to be resolved. Okay? But life extension programs in NNSA are actually in small budget programs. And I say that sort of laughing because I was talking about billions of dollars, but yes, these are small budget programs for NNSA. So let's look at some of their future plans for larger programs. So one is the uranium processing facility. This is the facility that's being built at Oak Ridge, which would process the uranium for use in nuclear weapons. In 2004, NNSA projected that it would cost about $600 million to just a little over $1 billion to complete. It was to be finished by 2018. Then it was going to be finished not before 2020. Then it was as late as 2022. Current estimate is 2025, and the price, instead of about $1 billion, has now gone up to $6.5 billion, and GAO estimates it'll take almost $1 billion more before the project is actually completed. Another big ticket project is the enrichment of uranium. So the immediate need is for a facility to make low enriched uranium for the production of tritium, which is used as a boost gas in nuclear weapons. And over the long term to make highly enriched uranium, which is the fuel that's used in naval reactors. NNSA estimates that it'll need low enriched uranium for tritium production by around 2038. And they have 2 plans in process that they're trying to decide between. So one is to use a small centrifuge that's being developed by Oak Ridge National Laboratory. It's not finished yet. And the current cost estimate for that is between $3 and about $7 billion. The preferred option is to use something called the AC-100. And this is a larger centrifuge that the Department of Energy invested in. It was supposed to be part of the US re-entry into a vibrant commercial nuclear energy development, nuclear energy sector, which has yet to happen. So DOE has invested money in the AC-100, and the idea was, well, let's use this potentially for uranium enrichment for nuclear weapons. And the cost estimate there is between $3 billion and a little over $11 billion. The problem is the AC-100 still has foreign-made components. And that means that any material that is enriched there would be obligated for use for only peaceful purposes. So the thing to take away from this is that the likely preferred option still isn't ready for prime time yet. It has some difficulties, and I'll come back to that in a bit. Next big ticket item is pit production, the ability to make new pits for nuclear weapons. Currently, the US has only a limited ability to do this, just a few, if any, per year at Los Alamos National Laboratory. Because Los Alamos has a very poor track record of being able to solve this problem of pit production, and because in the process it has encountered a variety of environmental challenges, as well as some concerns that it is not being sensitive to indigenous communities that are near these pit production facilities, there's now an effort to have a redundant pit production facility at Savannah River in an old, actually it's not old, it's a as of yet unused concrete shell that was supposed to be part of MOX, a non-proliferation effort. So currently the plans are for Los Alamos to make 30 pits per year by 2026, and for the Savannah River site to make 50 pits per year by 2030. Collectively, they would meet the congressional requirement for 80 pits per year. Now, the cost so far of the Los Alamos facility, the smaller of the two, is between $2 and $4 billion. It's supposed to be completed in 2028. The cost for the Savannah River facility, the rumor is that the first decision level, CD1, that the cost estimate for that facility is now $10 billion. Now, according to the Institute for Defense Analysis study of both of these plans, neither of them can meet the goal of making 80 pits per year by 2030. And according to NNSA's past cost history of being able to deliver major programs, they will also go significantly over budget. Right. These are not the only big ticket programs that NNSA has to deal with. They want a new lithium processing facility. Lithium is used in secondaries. The early stages of this suggested this could be done for $700 million. Latest cost estimate is almost $2 billion. Again, very early stages. They would like a new Center for Radiation Hardened Microelectronics. Again, significantly big ticket item. There are numerous other, quote, single points of failure in the NNSA infrastructure, a facility that if it broke down would cause all LEP processes, or at least some critical component of LEP processes, to either slow down or stop until the facility was repaired. But the problem is, we're told each of these programs, all of NNSA's items, are crucial for nuclear modernization, that they're essential for maintaining the arsenal, and that they're essential for national security, that the need is urgent, right? The problem is all these adjectives don't help us get around the fact that NNSA has been on GAO's list of major programs at risk for failure since GAO first started the list. Okay. Now, certainly, NNSA has improved over time, and you can imagine there are significant problems with making one-of-a-kind facilities where, thankfully, there isn't an off-the-shelf thing for modernizing your warhead. But that's not an excuse for ignoring the repeated problems that lead to cost growth and schedule delays. Plus, if we're to assume that these programs are critical for national security, then fixing NNSA's problems should be critical for national security, right? Because we're told that these things are essential. So if we can't solve NNSA's problems, and if over time they haven't been able to get around these persistent repeating issues, that means we need to make some other choices, and we need to make them now, all right? So a couple of ideas for concrete measures to address this situation. Number one, we should subject future life extension program requirements to independent review. Can we simply refurbish warheads? Are the plan changes necessary? What, if anything, needs to be new? Okay. My understanding is it's up to the President of the United States to articulate new military requirements for warheads. Yet if you look at NNSA's plans looking into the future, it certainly sounds like they have new military requirements, or at least new warheads. Right? Those two things don't add up together. So like I said, number one option would be independent review to separate out what is necessary versus just nice to have versus overly ambitious. Second set of options would be for reconsidering the need for one big ticket item, which is uranium enrichment. So one option is to just admit that there's plenty of enriched uranium currently in the stockpile, and we can use that to delay the need for future enrichment. So currently, the US nuclear weapons stockpile, we of course have deployed weapons, but we have a whole variety of nuclear weapons in various different stages of unreadiness. Some of them are a hedge in case we need them, but a variety of them are held in case we decide to use those warheads as the basis for future life extension programs. So one option we could choose is to review the nuclear weapons stockpile, determine how many of those additional warheads are actually likely to be necessary for new life extension programs, and release the rest of them for dismantlement. That way we could use that material to delay enriched uranium until later. We could also acknowledge that the risk of doing this is going down because NNSA is also planning to start remanufacturing new pits. So in some ways, you could consider holding these warheads in reserve, plus making new pits as redundant capabilities. We don't need both. Another option for reconsidering uranium enrichment is to reconsider the notion of peaceful use obligations. So for example, if NNSA determines that using the AC-100 is fine, that using that, even though it has foreign-made components, that they don't get in the way of peaceful use obligations, then why don't we just go to Urenco USA and ask them to do this enrichment for us, because they've indicated that they're willing to do so. Urenco USA would be a commercial enrichment firm. A couple of options for reducing or delaying the need for uranium enrichment. Just quickly, some options for changing pit production requirements. One is to reduce the plans for redundant capacity to make a certain number of pits per year. Okay. So the 2019 National Defense Authorization Act requires Los Alamos to produce up to 80 pits per year on its own. Savannah River is also very large and can produce at least up to 80 pits per year on its own. So collectively, that's 160 pits per year, which is double the official congressional requirement. We could revisit those plans, scale them down. Another option is to postpone pit production plans until NNSA has completed an assessment of pit aging that's verified by an independent authority. There are currently reputable estimates that pits last much longer than the current basis at the core of pit production plans. For example, in 2012, Livermore National Laboratory estimated that pits could last 150 years. So if we're conservative, we assume 100 years, we can still delay pit production until at least 2042, or if we really feel compelled to start now, we can start at a much, much lower rate. Okay. Third option, let's assume there might be arms control in the future. Reductions in nuclear weapons would reduce the need for low-enriched uranium, make more highly enriched uranium available for future naval reactors, reduce the need for pit production, lithium, Nnsa, as well as the size of future labs. So given that NNSA is unlikely to meet current schedules, even if they are critical, why not try arms control instead, right? That eliminates the need to make these future schedules for everything. And if we're going to talk about arms control, I'm going to circle back here to Steve's comment and say we get a double benefit from arms control on ICBMs. The driving force behind pit production and the schedule is the need to replace the current ICBM warhead. Right? So the schedule is being driven by the need to replace that warhead by the time the ground-based strategic deterrent comes online. So if we get rid of ICBMs or reduce them significantly, we get a double benefit from these things. So what I've tried to do is to outline numerous trade-offs that are possible for reducing the cost and the need for NNSA programs. Staying the course because of past decisions doesn't make it any more likely that these programs will be ready on time or within budget. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Sharon, for that sobering overview, and I'm sure we'll return to a few of the issues that you addressed. Amy, the floor is yours as well as your K9 assistant in the background.
Yeah, sorry about that. He was sleeping quite nicely until the voices picked up. I'm going to try and keep him quiet, and I'm going to apologize in advance for the fact that I won't be able to keep him quiet. Thank you, Kingston, for inviting me to speak today. And for those of you who don't know, I'm at the Congressional Research Service, where I have no opinions on anything, which is why I'm not going to either endorse or comment on either Steve or Sharon's presentations. I'm going to stay out of that fight. Kingston's asked me to talk about the relationship between nuclear modernization and arms control, which I think is better crafted just for the sake of alliteration as the recapitalization of nuclear forces and the negotiation of restraint on nuclear forces. So the relationship between recapitalization and restraint. And what I'm not going to do is answer the question of whether recapitalization is critical to, related to, or irrelevant to the negotiation of restraints on arms control on different types of weapons. So I basically just said I'm not going to answer the question. What I am going to do is I'm going to review two of the arguments that are frequently made about the relationship between nuclear modernization and arms control to place them in some historical context and add some texture to the debate. And the first of these two arguments that you hear often, particularly over the last 10 to 12 years, is that there's a grand bargain between recapitalization, modernization, and arms control that was evident and encouraged during the ratification debate over the New START Treaty when the Obama administration laid out its modernization plans to win votes for the Senate's advice and consent. And I'd like to begin by noting that that is not a grand bargain. It is not a strategic consensus. It is a tactical arrangement. The linkage here between arms control and modernization is a tactical arrangement. And it actually first appeared in the Strategic Posture Commission report back in 2008, 2009. And this is what the Posture Commission said. They said, despite our many differences of opinion about the possibilities and priorities, we have come together around a grand strategy. It is firmly grounded in the strategic tradition of the United States in balancing deterrence and other means, including principally arms control and nonproliferation, to reduce nuclear dangers. So they laid it out as a grand bargain, a strategic consensus. But that fell apart almost as soon as it was enunciated. You can find people who served on the Posture Commission and supported modernization arguing even before New START was signed that they supported arms control, just not the kind of arms control that this administration, the Obama administration, was doing. And you can find people, including some who have spoken today, who argued, oh, we support modernization, just not all the programs that you've proposed that we modernize. So this tactical arrangement fell apart almost as soon as it was enunciated. And it also showed some weight and influence in the debate in Congress. So this is where the idea that it is a consensus-forming strategic bargain comes from. You often heard, particularly over the first 5 or 6 years after New START entered into force, that there was a consensus in Congress in support of the modernization programs that was won over in response to the ratification of New START. But that consensus has always been somewhat fragile. From the beginning, there have been members who wanted to pull some pieces out of the consensus box, others who wanted to push pieces into the consensus box. And it was fragile in that if pieces or parts were added or removed, the broader consensus would fall apart. You also didn't hear much in those first 5 or 6 years that one of the items in that consensus box was New START, because it was obvious that New START was in the box. It was underway, it was working well. But in the last 2 or 3 years, 4 years, there was a need for reminders that New START was in the box. And it happened a couple of times during the previous administration. Senator Corker, during one hearing, had to remind the administration officials that the congressional support for modernization was linked to New START and therefore to the extension of New START. But there was evident dismay within the administration about this, that there was, you could hear John Bolton say it, and he said it was unlikely that New START would be extended. So you could talk to the people in the Pentagon who were pushing for the existing modernization programs and some new ones and ask them, well, what about this two-sided consensus? that arms control, the extension of New START, should be accompanying the support for the modernization programs. And if you don't do the extension, you could lose your consensus. And if you ask people in the Pentagon that, they would sometimes go, oh, well, we think Congress is bluffing, that they didn't think that this grand bargain or even tactical arrangement existed. What's really interesting is that some of the people who whispered, oh, they're bluffing 3-4 years ago, are now arguing that modernization must continue because New START has been extended, and therefore this deal, this consensus, has to be held together. So a couple of years ago, it was a bluff. Now it's a reality. And I don't point this out to accuse anyone of his hypocrisy or to disparage anyone's views. I point it out because that is evidence that this is a tactical arrangement, not a grand bargain. So the idea that arms control and modernization have to go together because it's always been that way since New START was in place is a tactical arrangement. Now, the second point that Kingston has asked me to address, as the dog keeps barking, is the argument that the United States can only achieve success in arms control negotiations if it is also expending funds on modernizing its nuclear arsenal. And that narrative comes from looking backwards. If you look back over the arms control history, you can see, oh, weapons program here, a couple of years later, arms control agreement. So the two things must go together. You must have your weapons program, and then you can get your arms control agreement. The problem is that's a backwards looking narrative. It doesn't really work if you start at the beginning and look forward. Basically, most of the weapons programs were not designed to give you an arms control agreement, although one can see a correlation between the two. But as we all learned in graduate school, correlation is not causation. It's also not a proof of a lack of linkage, it's just a correlation. So the narrative tends to ignore the debates, the discussions, the politics, and the arguments in favor of the weapon system at the time. It's not as if it was, let's build a weapon so we can get arms control. It was, let's build a weapon so we can build a weapon. And later, oh, we got arms control. Let me give you a couple of examples. And the article that I would presume Shannon has posted here has more of these details. But you hear often that the United States and Soviet Union reached agreement on the ABM treaty after the United States began to fully fund and prepare to deploy the Safeguard anti-ballistic missile system. And therefore, it was the US strong support for Safeguard that won Russian agreement on the ABM treaty. Kingston's laughing as I throw treats to the dog. The problem is support for the Safeguard system wasn't strong. It was actually quite weak. Congress came within one vote of killing the program. The scientists were all testifying about how the program wouldn't work. And it was quite evident that as the United States and Soviet Union deployed multiple warheads to their ICBMs, the limited ABM systems would be totally useless. So the Nixon administration came up and argued that the Safeguard system had to be continued as a bargaining chip. Yes, clearly it's not an effective weapon system. We don't have strong support for it, but we need the bargaining chip. And we bargained that away. So Safeguard was saved by the bargaining chip argument, not by the strong support for a weapon system that we are then going to use to negotiate. So then you might ask, well, what about the more obvious case, the INF treaty? NATO and the United States and its allies agreed in 1979 on something known as a dual track decision to deploy US intermediate range weapons in Europe, as long as they were part of a process to negotiate arms control with the Soviet Union in an effort to try and limit the SS-20 ICBM, intermediate range ballistic missiles, sorry, not ICBM. But the dual track decision was never intended to eliminate INF missiles, which is what the INF treaty did. NATO actually wanted to deploy those missiles to fill a gap in their capabilities, and they were willing to accept just limits on the SS-20s. They weren't trying to eliminate the missiles. That's in 1979. Clearly, the US negotiating position in 1981 was different. We can go into why that was, but it's not particularly relevant to my argument here. The point being that the INF missiles were never seen as a way to eliminate INF missiles. The second point is that as soon as the United States started deploying the INF missiles, the Soviet Union walked out of the talks. The missiles did not produce a treaty, they produced a walkout. When the negotiations resumed in 1985, a lot of things had changed. Not only had the missiles been deployed, but Gorbachev was now leading the Soviet Union. Reagan was committed to arms control. Gorbachev was committed to arms control. And it was these other elements of the environment that contributed to the conclusion of the INF Treaty. Now, I can't run a counter experiment and see if we can achieve an ABM treaty without the safeguard system, or to see if we can achieve an INF treaty without the deployment of the INF missiles. Obviously, I can't run the counter example, but I can tell you there was a whole lot of other stuff going on that brought about the negotiations of the treaty. And that's my point. Bottom line, I can't tell you whether the correlation means their linkage is required, the linkage is not required, that you do need it, that you don't need it. It is a correlation, but there was a lot of other stuff going on. So if you're looking forward from here and asking yourself, how much modernization do we need to achieve arms control, or can we achieve arms control if we exercise restraint, or any of those questions, I can't answer those for you. But what I can tell you is that recapitalization and restraint, i.e. modernization and arms control, are both tools of US national security strategy. We do them because they serve our own national interests. And we should continue to do them, one or the other or both, if they meet a national security interest. They may interact in the long run, these two tools, and they may not interact in the long run. But the assumptions on both sides that you can't have one without the other, or that there is no interaction at all, these overstate the history. So for the, Kingston asked me to make some recommendations for the future. My recommendations are to remember that arms control is a lot more complicated than build the weapon and give it away. They're both tools of US national security, and decisions about them should be made on those grounds, not on the grounds of whether or not they're bargaining chips or bribes or whatever other tool you think. That's where I'm going to stop and hope the dog stops barking.
Great, thanks so much, Amy. A lot of really important context that you just provided. And I think your dog was barking in endorsement of all the points that you were making. Steve, I want to start with you. We've got a lot of great questions that have come in. So Keith, please keep thinking of those and sending those in. Steve, you mentioned some of the rationales that the Pentagon has put forward for the GBSD program and replacing the Minuteman system. It seems to me one of the strongest, if not the strongest, rationale for GBSD in case against extending Minuteman is that the ICBM leg of the triad requires new capabilities given the threat environment that the Minuteman III can't provide, such as additional target coverage, the ability to penetrate advancing air and missile defenses. Whenever, at least I make an attempt to probe that claim further, you quickly run into the classification wall. So I was wondering if you could shed some light on this rationale for GBSD, how compelling or not do you find it? And I guess first principles, what is it in fact that the Pentagon, the Air Force want GBSD to be able to do militarily that the Minuteman can't?
That is a good question, Kingston. So my experience in the Obama administration was that the principal argument in favor of GBSD was not that Minuteman could not be extended. It was that the Air Force wanted the additional capabilities that would come with a new missile. And as you say, it is difficult to talk in any detailed way about what those additional capabilities would be in terms of range or throw weight, because the details are classified. But I think much of it relates to, like you mentioned, penetrating missile defenses. The US has an active missile defense program. Even if other countries don't, we tend to mirror image. We tend to assume that other countries will do eventually what we're doing. I think we have sort of deluded ourselves to believe that our missile defense is or can be effective. And so we project that other countries may be may develop similarly effective missile defenses and that we would need additional penetration capabilities. I really don't think those arguments hold water, though, because whatever additional penetration capability you'd want to add could easily be added to the Trident missile, which is currently carrying only half as many warheads as it was designed to carry, and so has substantial additional range or ability to carry other countermeasure packages. So I did not find those arguments persuasive. The arguments for GBSD persuasive.
Great, thanks, Steve. Sharon, we've received several questions ahead of the event regarding the NNSA's current plans for plutonium pit production, which you described in some detail in your opening remarks. So I guess the first question I have for you is, should the United States as a nuclear armed state, have the capability to produce plutonium pits, and if not, if the current requirement of at least 80 is excessive to need and frankly unachievable, what might a more achievable level look like that would also provide the needed capability? And then, as you mentioned, the current plan is to build pits at 2 sites now, and that was something new proposed by the Trump administration at both Los Alamos and Savannah River. So, do you have a view on whether 2 sites are needed, whether it's feasible to do it at 1? Would be interested in your thoughts on those 2 questions.
So thanks very much. So the question of whether or not you need a pit production facility is really derivative of, do you need new pits or not, which is a question of how long the pits you currently have are going to last. And here the estimates are all over the place. Like I said, the low end is about 80 years, and that's the one that NNSA is using to drive the current requirements, versus Livermore Labs' own estimate of about 150. The Jasons have done an independent review of this and come in at around 100 years. So, and NNSA was supposed to do an additional study of this, which my understanding is hasn't been completed yet. So the whole question of whether or not you need new pits is dependent on what your assumptions are about pit life. I'd like to, it's not that a pit suddenly turns to cream cheese or whatever kind of cheesy flavor you want to make of your nuclear weapons pit, or that suddenly it explodes uncontrollably. What happens is its ability to meet military requirements starts to degrade. And so we can't talk here about exactly what those military requirements are, but another option is to recognize that the pit is perhaps not capable of doing what it used to be doing, and to figure into your strategic calculation the relationship between having nuclear weapons that might be very capable, just not the same as they used to be, versus the impact on arms control and proliferation if the US suddenly, after 20 some odd years, re-enters the pit production business and sends a signal to the world that we're actually interested in keeping nuclear weapons at the core of our national security for the indefinite future, and perhaps, depending on who's president, even making more nuclear weapons. So this is not just an issue simply about the age of pits or whether or not pits are necessary. If you put that question within the broader national security context, it has lots of other ramifications. Basically, there are a couple of different widgets you can trade off to decide if and when you might need pit production, aside from those questions about aging. So one is, like I said, how long? The second is, what's the size of your arsenal? Obviously, if arms control reduces the size of the nuclear weapons arsenal, you have less need for pits. And then you can also manipulate how many pits per year you make versus the start date. So why suddenly 2 pit production facilities? I suspect this is actually, and I don't necessarily know this is the case, but I suspect this is actually the frustration of the Defense Department with the inability of Los Alamos National Laboratory to actually make good on their repeated promises to make nuclear weapons pits. They've been trying to do this for a long time. They've run into a bunch of repeated failures. But I would argue that a redundant facility sends international signals about what the U.S. is planning to do with nuclear weapons and how many pits it wants to make. So I would suggest that rather than sending a signal that we're willing to invest in excessive pit production facilities, the safer course would be to try and get one smaller facility right, or admit that we can actually have several years to discuss this and to consider options. And before we pursue any of them, make sure that we actually have a solid plan in place before we end up wasting billions of dollars doing something that ends up not providing what we actually need at the time. I mean, one horrible possible outcome, right, would be that we invest tens of billions of dollars in a pit production facility only to no longer need those pits because we've reduced to 1,000 nuclear weapons. And under the Obama administration, the Pentagon admitted that it could get by with 1,000 nuclear weapons and still meet all of its requirements. Why not try that?
Thanks, Sharon. Thanks to all the great questions that are coming in. I think some of these questions have been addressed by the speakers in their opening comments. So given the limit on time that we have, I'm going to try to address some of the questions that respond to some of the comments or raise additional issues. Amy, we got a question from Tom Countryman, the Arms Control Association's chairman of the board, and he asked a little bit of a twist on your remarks. Can we identify any time period in which the U.S. was not pursuing robust spending on modernization? And if there is such a period, does anyone argue that this led to a decline in arms control agreements?
It is an interesting twist. If you look at the graphs of spending on nuclear modernization as a percent of either DoD spending or GDP, you see three distinct peaks in that spending: the early 1960s, the early 1980s, and now we're going to see it again around 2030. We're heading into it. So one could argue that if it's not a peak, it's a trough. And the interesting point, and I make this in the article, and it's not quite a really good case, but it shows some evidence. The Reagan administration plussed up defense spending and nuclear weapons modernization spending a lot in the first 3 to 4 years. In that time period, we did not achieve arms control. That's when we deployed the INF missiles and the Soviets walked out of the talks. Those spending increases flattened out at the beginning of the second Reagan administration. So we were no longer increasing defense spending. One can argue the programs were continuing due to funding provided earlier, but at that point in time, when we were no longer increasing the defense budget, we achieved the INF Treaty and the START Treaty. And if you go back and look at the record of negotiations of the START Treaty, you can actually see that all of the modernization programs that were in place didn't actually contribute to the conclusion of the treaty. The treaty was not done by the end of the Reagan administration. The Bush administration had to resume. And a lot of the delays at the end of negotiating the treaty were due to the fact that we had so many programs going on that we had to work out the rules and the limits and the provisions regarding all of those separate programs. So it's not equivalent to saying when we were restrained, we achieved arms control. That's not what was going on there. But the bottom line remains the same. There's a whole bunch of other stuff going on there besides just the correlation between spending and arms control.
Thanks, Amy. Steve, I want to come back to you on GBSD again and ICBMs. So we got a question from Jack Weinstein ahead of the event. He's the former Air Force Chief of Staff for Strategic and Nuclear Integration. And the question he had is, if in calling for either the elimination of ICBMs or continued reliance on the Minuteman III, we are making overly optimistic assumptions about the continued and long-term survivability of the submarine-based leg of the triad of the ballistic missile submarines. And I think this gets to one of the rationales for ICBMs, which is that they are a hedge against a potential, I guess right now, unforeseen vulnerability to the SSBN force, but given the advancing pace of technology, certainly not something, I suppose, that's impossible to foresee. So how would you respond to this argument that by not proceeding with GBSD and instead continuing to rely on Minuteman, that we're putting too much of a burden on the ballistic missile submarine force?
That's a good question. And I would point to the last two nuclear posture reviews for an authoritative statement that there are no identified or foreseeable threats to the survivability of the US SSBN force. I don't have the exact wording in front of me, but if you Google the last two NPRs, you will find a fairly definitive statement that no threats have been identified or are foreseen to the survivability. But second, I would say, if we are worried about the survivability of submarines, silo-based ICBMs are not the answer because they're vulnerable to attack. They are not a survivable deterrent. No one I know would consider them to be an adequate deterrent force because they would not just require a launch under attack option to present a deterrent. We would have to commit irrevocably to launch on warning in order for silo-based ICBMs to be a credible deterrent to an attack. And I don't know anyone who believes that that would be a desirable or acceptable option. So if we're worried about the survivability of SSBNs, we should be looking for other survivable platforms, including basing modes for ICBMs, such as mobile ICBMs, which were considered by the Air Force in its analysis of alternatives and dismissed.
Thanks, Steve. Sharon and Amy, you both, I know, follow the debate about the future of the ICBM very closely. If you have any comments or observations about the questions that I put to Steve or his presentation, would be happy to hear any of those if you'd like to weigh in.
Sure. One of the points to be made on the debate about whether or not getting rid of the ICBM force is a problem because of the vulnerabilities of the SSBN force. It's not just whether the submarines can be tracked down and destroyed. When Secretary Perry first made the lead and hedge argument back in the 90s for why we needed a triad, why we needed separate legs, it also recognized vulnerabilities in the technological capacity of each of the legs. So if there were a problem with the SLBMs, cracks in the propellant, or something else that required taking down the force for a short period of time, the ICBM could fill that gap for the brief period of time, not because it was survivable, but because it was credible for that brief period of time. So the argument in favor of a triad was not just that the oceans would become transparent or submarines would become vulnerable, but that each leg provided a hedge against problems in the other legs. The capacity of ICBMs to do that is probably, irrespective of whether it's a new ICBM or an old ICBM, but probably better if it's a new ICBM. The reliability levels, though, are so relatively high that I don't think it would make that much of a difference in terms of new versus old ICBM, but it's still not just whether or not the submarines might become vulnerable in the future.
Great, thanks, Amy. I think a question for both Sharon and Steve, and also Amy, if you'd like to weigh in. But we have several questions that have come in about how adjusting the current U.S. nuclear modernization effort might impact deterrence with Russia and China. Of course, one of the arguments in favor of proceeding with the current approach is that both Russia and China are aggressively modernizing their nuclear forces, that according to U.S. intelligence estimates, both Russia and China are poised to increase the size of their nuclear warhead stockpiles over the next decade. And in general, Russian and Chinese behavior currently is not exactly consistent with U.S. support and defense of a rules-based international order. So how would you respond to this, this argument that because of what Russia and China are doing, the United States needs to attempt to keep up, lest the credibility of the deterrent erode?
I guess I would just say, I think nuclear deterrence between the United States and Russia and between the United States and China is extremely robust, and that it would be robust and stable if the United States did not deploy a new ICBM at all, or if it extended Minuteman, that it has essentially nothing to do with that. So you mentioned the modernization programs of Russia and China. The irony is that those are fueled to a substantial extent by US ballistic missile defense efforts, something that we refuse to acknowledge. But if you read President Putin's speech from March of 3 years ago, he lays out the case for why all 5 of those modernization programs are motivated by US ballistic missile defense. And in fact, none of those programs would make any sense apart from a concern about the ability of Russian forces to penetrate missile defenses. And Chinese analysts have also expressed concern with US missile defense and have used that as a rationale for the need to increase the size of their strategic forces to ensure a credible deterrent against the United States. So I don't see it linked to our offensive strategic programs at all. In fact, I think what we're seeing is a return to the very logic of the beginning of arms control, when we realized in the late 1960s that defense was linked to offense, and without agreed constraints on defense, it would be difficult to limit, maybe impossible to limit, the modernization and expansion of offensive forces.
So I would just add, I agree with Steve completely about both the role of missile defense and deterrence being robust. But I would also point out that deterrence at its core is a psychological relationship. And the arguments about micromanaging it, that you need specific numbers of weapons or specific improvements here or there, and suddenly deterrence is gone if you don't do that, I think need to be closely examined, or quite frankly, just ignored. I mean, the notion that somehow our current arsenal and the ability to inflict damage on Russia and China isn't sufficient for deterrence, I think making that argument needs a robust burden of proof, because it seems the notion that these increases in capabilities, or just something new, or in the case of ICBM, something that's just slightly improved, that's crucial for deterrence, I don't see that history has borne that out at all.
And if I could just add one more point, there was a review of nuclear policy in the middle of the Obama administration that concluded that the United States could reduce its forces by 1/3. And that, of course, was the basis of an offer to have additional arms control negotiations. But I should say that 1/3 reduction, that was not premised on a reduction in Russian forces. That was what was determined to be necessary for nuclear deterrence. And so, as Sharon says, I think saying that, well, if you had 50 more warheads, deterrence would somehow be more robust, or if you had 100 fewer, that somehow it would be less robust, is just not correct.
So Amy, I want to come to you. There's a few questions that have come in with respect to the potential fielding of US ground-launched missiles in the Asia-Pacific theater in particular, with a range formerly prohibited by the INF Treaty, and whether fielding of those missiles might make China more likely, or give China a greater incentive to discuss with the United States limits on China's very robust arsenal of such fielded weapons. So, without asking you to say whether, commenting on the case for or lack thereof of fielding such U.S. missiles and the potential challenges to doing so. What might the history of the INF negotiations tell us about the feasibility of that approach?
There's a point of view in terms of the achievement of the INF treaty that Moscow really was spooked by the INF missiles in Europe and their ability to target command and control targets in Moscow in 5 minutes or less. That brought them back to the negotiating table. And that is one of those other things going on that helped achieve the negotiations. The question for the relationship with China is whether US INF range missiles deployed somewhere 3,000 miles away from the Chinese coast, because you're looking at Guam, basically, unless you're putting them on ships, would bring that same pressure to China. That isn't, if that pressure isn't there now, to have them say, oh, we have to get these US missiles out of Asia so that Beijing isn't vulnerable. The problem with that argument is the United States is would not be putting those missiles in Guam to target Beijing. It's a part of suppressing the A2AD capability, which does not mean striking the seats of power in the capital. And it also would assume that there are no other US capabilities that hold Beijing at risk. There's a lot of moving parts to that argument, but first you'd have to acknowledge that you can't recreate that single point of pressure of prompt under 5 minutes attack on Moscow that was evident in the INF debate. You can't recreate that in the Asia scenario. And, oh, by the way, the reason we are deploying missiles, intermediate range missiles, and the reason they are deploying intermediate range missiles has nothing to do with whether or not capitals will be vulnerable. So I think given that both sides would be doing what they're doing for national security purposes, which may or may not, but certainly don't exclusively include targeting capitals, means it's a much more complicated calculation.
Great. Thanks, Amy. I think we have time for about one more round of questions before I turn it back over to Daryl to close the event. And I wanted to pull together a few threads of questions that have come in and how they again pertain to the future of the ICBM force in particular. One of the arguments among the many arguments that the Pentagon has made for the ground-based strategic deterrent program and replacing the Minuteman III is that the infrastructure is very old, of course, and many parts for the Minuteman III system just currently aren't made anymore. So Admiral Mitchell, the head of U.S. Strategic Command, pointed to some switches and launch control facilities. They're only down to 2 spares, and so we need GBSD to replace the entire supporting command and control system. And alongside that, according to the Pentagon, it will be easier to cyber defend or to defend against cyber attack the new GBSD system, which has struck me as an interesting claim, given that the Minuteman III system is a very old system built before the emergence of the internet. It's an analog system, hardwired, so it's not clear to me why it's harder to cyber defend the current system by a new system. But we have gotten several questions with respect to cybersecurity and how, as the United States modernizes its forces, what are some of the challenges associated with securing those forces against cyber attacks? So Steve and Sharon, if you wanted to take on that question and then turn it back to Daryl.
I guess I would just quickly say I don't see why there's a linkage between the silo and launch control center infrastructure and the missile itself, or at least a strong linkage. I've heard, for example, people say that the silos are in terrible shape. This is why we need GBSD. Water is leaking into the silos and no one makes the pumps any longer that pump the water out of the silo. Well, GBSD is going to use the same silo. So those problems would have to be fixed with GBSD. And I don't see why extending the life of Minuteman precludes making the necessary fixes to the silos that would have to be made in any case. And again, I'm confident that if the Air Force wanted to extend the current equipment by remanufacturing it, it could do so, but the other option would be to replace the equipment with new equipment. It is hard to have a detailed discussion about cyber risks, though, without knowing all of the details, which obviously we don't know. But I agree that, I mean, there are certain advantages in having very old infrastructure, in having, for example, 8-inch floppy disks for the and an old Fortran compiler used for the code. That gives you a certain protection against interference. But Sharon, would you like to add?
Sure, just two brief things. So one, the argument about, oh, we can't continue to sustain Minuteman III because the parts, we don't have any more of them. Well, I'm pretty sure that the parts for GBSD aren't sitting on the shelf at Walmart somewhere where you can just go pick them up, right? So regardless of what we do, we're going to have to recreate supply lines and everything else. So that argument doesn't hold water with me at all. It's true for Minuteman III, it's true for GBSD. So why not make the parts for something that isn't going to suggest you're modernizing a major part of your arsenal? And the argument about cybersecurity, there's one key way to improve the cybersecurity of ICBMs, and that's to acknowledge their unique vulnerability. And the best way to acknowledge their unique vulnerability, in my view, is to adopt a no first use policy that requires you to sit back, wait, and decide if maybe whatever has happened in terms of a threat or an incoming issue is actually really what it claims to be, as opposed to a mistake, a hack, or a miscalculation. That's the best way to improve cybersecurity for GBSD.
Thanks again to all three of our speakers for that incredibly rich conversation. I think we covered lots of ground. Of course, there's still more ground to be covered, but thanks to all three of you so much. And Daryl, back to you.
Well, thank you, Kingston, and thanks to Sharon and Amy and Steve for that fabulous exploration of this complex array of issues that are before the Biden administration and the Congress. We're going to hear in just about a week about how the Biden administration wants to handle some of these questions with its initial budget request for fiscal 2022. That will just be the next phase in the debate about U.S. nuclear weapons modernization. And we hope everybody has learned something here in this discussion. We're going to be providing a archived version of this, a recording on our website at armscontrol.org in a day or two. Our team will put that together along with Congressman Garamendi's video, which is already available on the Arms Control Association YouTube channel. As we have noted in the chat, there are a number of articles by Sharon and Steve and Amy that are worth taking a look at for further discussion. And in a few days, there'll be more coming from our team, our research team, Kingston Reef and Shannon Bugos, about the nuclear weapons modernization debate. And as we look at these issues, and as Congress looks at these issues, I would just underscore a couple things that I'm hearing from this discussion, which is that serious policymakers and legislators and citizens need to ask some hard questions about these policy issues and about how the government is presenting the options. We need to ask what assumptions are behind the requirements that we hear about from the Department of Defense and the NSA. We need to ask hard questions about how many nuclear weapons are enough to deter nuclear attack, what other options exist to deal with the task of maintaining the U.S. arsenal while we pursue a world free of nuclear weapons, and what diplomatic options and arms control initiatives exist to reduce the threats, the nuclear threats of U.S. adversaries that create the rationale for maintaining a nuclear arsenal in the first place. These are some hard questions that we as citizens need to keep asking and encourage our policymakers to keep asking. So let me end it there, and let me thank everybody for this great discussion. Appreciation to all, and we are adjourned. Thank you.